DC Comics superheroes have a long lineage in the medium of video games, with some adaptations like the Batman Arkham series proving hugely popular. For some members of the DC library, on the other hand, success has eluded them. In the case of Green Lantern, it wasn't until 2011 that the character finally received their own video game. This came in the form of Green Lantern Rise of the Manhunters, a tie-in to the Green Lantern movie starring Ryan Reynolds. This beat 'em up by Double Helix Entertainment, which was built from the remnants of a cancelled Justice League fighting game, underperformed much like the movie that inspired it. That was by no means the first attempt to translate the character into video game form, however. That honour belonged to the once prominent UK developer Ocean Software, who was producing a Green Lantern game for the SNES in the early 1990s. For decades, the unreleased project has remained largely shrouded in mystery, with memories of it being kept alive by archived magazine scans and enthusiast websites picking up the pieces. Thanks to the tireless efforts of game historians, namely Frank Gasking, the creator of Games That Weren't, much of the game's history has at last been demystified. In 2019, Frank's search to preserve Ocean's Lost project bore fruit as he recovered a prototype cartridge from the project. As a result of this discovery, in partnership with Games That Weren't, we can now exclusively bring you the world's first glimpse of the game in motion. In this installment of Game History Secrets, I'll be exploring the history of Ocean Software's Green Lantern and why the game never came to be. Ocean Software was a studio based in Manchester, England, founded in 1983. The company initially made its name developing clones and conversions of popular arcade games for home computers, such as Donkey Kong. It was a bit later into the decade that Ocean Star would truly rise, however, as they entered the business of licensed games. One of their breakout hits using this approach arrived in 1987. They took a chance on a little-known Hollywood script about a cybernetically altered police officer, purchasing the rights to adapt it into a video game prior to its release. Robocop would go on to become one of the biggest movies of the year, and Ocean's gamble paid off for them hugely. They were able to get their adaptation of the movie out within the same year, allowing them to quickly recoup the relatively small amount paid for the license. The game was very well received, and the studio had a monster hit on its hands, as it dominated UK sales charts for over a year. Ocean's success opened the door to bigger, more established names. The studio partnered with Warner Bros. To produce a tie-in game to the 1989 Batman movie for home computers. Capitalizing upon hype around the film once again, the game sold well, further solidifying their strong working relationship with WB. Ocean's numerous Batman games paved the way to them gaining greater access to DC's back catalogue in the early 1990s. The company took an interest in a number of properties around this time, first Watchmen, followed by Lobo, and Green Lantern. The latter would end up becoming their focus, and by 1991, a Green Lantern game entered the preliminary stages of development at Ocean Software. At this point, it was being planned for the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST. Ideas were fluid, but cast Hal Jordan as the playable Green Lantern of choice. This sketch of the character, drawn by artist Mike Marshall, was one of the earliest examples of pen being put to paper on the project. It was created as part of an internship that Marshall had arranged at Ocean's Manchester offices. The project was worked on for no more than a few months before being put on ice. By all indications, the developers were struggling to come up with a solid design plan for the Amiga and ST platforms. It was shelved accordingly, with the intention of one day revisiting it. That day eventually arrived a couple of years later. By 1993, Ocean had pivoted to home console development and had a number of titles in the works for the SNES. Among them was a tie-in game inspired by the live-action Dennis the Menace movie, which launched just in time for the holiday season. Programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn were frequent collaborators at Ocean who had worked together on the game, and now found themselves in search of their next project. They would soon be paired up again, this time for a revived Green Lantern project being overseen by Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development and resident comic book enthusiast. The company's management had made the decision to bring it back on the Super Nintendo. Its improved graphical capabilities over older hardware allowed for more creative freedom, and they had already developed technology that could be used for Green Lantern. Recycling platforming code from Dennis the Menace, Green Lantern was predominantly a side-scrolling platformer with puzzle elements. Pulling right from the comics, Green Lantern's ring could project all manner of different shapes and objects to battle enemies and aid in progression, such as a giant green anvil. Their Green Lantern of choice was again Hal Jordan, the main Green Lantern in the comics at this time. The game's plot pulled from an obscure area of the source material that had only been briefly touched upon in a 1963 story called The Green Lantern Disasters. In it, Hal Jordan travels to the distant world of Zeos, a planet of intelligent insects which is home to a grasshopper-like Green Lantern named Zax. Hal finds Zeos under the thumb of a gang of bugs which has seized the planet's food supply of sugar and helps Zax defeat them. While Zax would go on to very occasionally appear in other Green Lantern media, this was, prior to 1993, the only instance in which his homeworld Zeos was shown. Regardless, it was this little known corner of the DC universe around which Ocean decided to base their game's story. In the Green Lantern game, the Queen of Zeos threatens the fate of the universe when she sends her army of insectoid creatures to obtain a series of mythical crystals. If she is successful, the artifacts will grant them invincibility, allowing them to rule over existence unchallenged. The Green Lantern sets out to stop her, traversing various alien worlds on his way to Zeos itself to defeat her. The Zeos Queen is said to have been a fully original character that was inspired by the Queen from the 1986 sci-fi movie Aliens. The game was planned to transition between different genres of gameplay, mixing platforming levels with vertical and horizontal shoot-'em-up stages, in addition to sections which leveraged the system's Mode 7 capabilities. In these parts, players would maneuver the hero as he flies over a moonscape environment, evading and returning fire in forward-facing aerial combat. Its variety was a result of the disjointed manner in which the game was built. Separate small groups of people throughout Ocean's offices made each section individually before connecting them later in development. This slapdash approach was typical for the company at the time. Their games often followed only a loose outline, being formed in different groups and pieced together later on. It was this approach that some commentators believe was to the project's detriment and contributed to it never seeing the light of day.
The reason why it fell apart, it was because of the mismanagement. There was no clear plan, I'd say, from the start. I think in the old days of Ocean, they kind of had that winging it mentality where they chuck stuff together. They used to put games together in like 2 or 3 weeks sometimes if there was a Christmas deadline. But on the smaller platforms, you could get away with that. But I think as you got onto platforms, 16-bit platforms, it was much harder to do. And Green Lantern didn't really have a clear game design document. There wasn't a clear plan they were following. They were making it up. And I think that caused problems because they were chucking stuff in which didn't really fit.
For the time being, the game chugged along regardless into 1994, when, early into the year, it was disrupted by some big changes being made to the property at DC. The comic book giant had observed a slump in sales of Green Lantern and began plotting out a significant shake-up in order to renew interest in the series. These plans came into play when Hal Jordan's home Coast City was eviscerated by the supervillain duo of Mongol and Cyborg Superman. Overcome by grief, Hal later attempts in vain to recreate his lost home by using his power ring, but surmises that a larger energy source will be required in order to accomplish his goal. His grief twists into madness, sending him on a rampage across the universe, slaughtering his fellow Green Lanterns along the way. He eventually arrives at the Green Lantern Corps HQ, where he wipes out all but one of the Guardians of the Universe and steals their main source of power. He emerges from the experience as the villain Parallax. Ganthert, the last surviving Guardian, travels to Earth and entrusts a ring of power to an unassuming freelance artist named Kyle Rayner. This controversial storyline, named Emerald Twilight, ran throughout the first months of 1994. It turned the star of Ocean's game from hero to villain and was plotted out entirely without their knowledge. This meant that the team had to suddenly replace Hal Jordan with Kyle Rayner as the protagonist mid-development, a mandate handed down to them by DC with no prior warning. Parallax would later become reworked into a boss character that Kyle would have fought partway through the story. Following these changes, the title was reported to have had a small presence at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show of 1994. It also appeared in game magazines shortly thereafter. It was expected to be released in late 1994, according to the information supplied to these outlets. For this brief space of time, development was seemingly going smoothly, but as the year went on, the game's fate was cast into uncertainty. In mid-1994, Gary Bracey, Ocean's VP of Development, resigned from the company amid rumours of a possible takeover. Fearing a change in Ocean's workplace culture, he left before Green Lantern was completed. Over the years, many have given credit to Bracey's leadership as a key factor in Ocean's success. His departure set the stage for some of the difficulties that would follow. Green Lantern's SNES game was, according to former Ocean staff, finished on schedule by late 1994. A soundtrack had been recorded in full by Dean Evans, the studio's resident composer, and a bombastic conclusion to the story had been mapped out. Players would have infiltrated the outer rim of Zeos in an R-Type-esque horizontal shooting section before descending beneath the planet's surface to eventually confront the Queen in a final boss sequence. The game was awaiting testing when it was rocked once more by external forces. In September of that year, DC kicked off another world-altering event that was heavily based around the Green Lantern characters. 0 Hour Crisis in Time was a massive crossover storyline which had major implications for the entire DC universe. Hal Jordan, aka Parallax, used his newfound powers to reset the universe from scratch in the hopes of restoring Coast City and those who had perished. DC used this premise to wipe the slate clean, undoing certain past events and laying the groundwork for the future. This was another major development in the comic books that licensees Ocean Software had no prior knowledge of, but one which they would have to quickly adapt to in order for their game to see the light of day. DC instructed them that the game would need to be reworked to be set after the events of 0 Hour. This meant removing and/or changing characters from the previous version of the DC universe, such as Parallax. The changes needed to get it up to code were apparently significant, and Ocean Software's remaining management weren't keen to implement them. Despite it being very close to the finish line, a decent investment was still required to give it the refresh it needed. By late 1994, Ocean had concerns that the Super Nintendo's expiration date was drawing near. Weighing this up with the costs of revamping the game led them to shelving the project. Within a short space of time, the Green Lantern video game had gone from briefly being considered content complete to outright cancelled. The decision was made as part of a shift in priorities for Ocean Software, whose management was intending to phase out the development of 2D games and focus on 3D ones. This was met with some dissent from two key employees, programmer Andrew Deacon and artist Ivan Horn. As Frank Gasking explains, this creative disagreement quickly escalated with severe consequences.
Ivan and Andrew weren't particularly happy about that. They kind of voiced their concerns about it. It wasn't a great idea, and then the next thing they know, they're basically let go. They no longer have jobs, so they're gone essentially, and that they were completely shocked by that. So by the sounds of it, they took their code with them. They didn't actually leave any remains of it at Ocean.
For a few weeks, the fate of Ocean's Green Lantern appeared to be resolved, when, against the odds, the company chose to revive it. Bobby Earl, a programmer at the studio, had requested additional work hours in order to fund a mortgage deposit on a new house. After weighing up their options, Ocean went back on their previous call and placed him in charge of revamping their Green Lantern SNES game. Earl spent his usual hours at Ocean developing Silver, an RPG for PC. When the working day ended for most other employees, he switched over to Green Lantern. As the lone programmer on the project, and Andrew Deakin's code effectively gone, Earl had to rebuild much of the game himself. But there were still plenty of assets from the previous iteration he had access to. Large swaths of the art were reused, such as backgrounds, and the musical score from Dean Evans was brought back too. This new version of the project, seen here in motion for the first time, was built using the engine from Ocean's Jurassic Park 2 game. This side-scrolling shooter was a fresh take on the property that endeavoured to be more faithful to the comic books in the hopes of appeasing DC's higher-ups. The game's planned opening is particularly indicative of this approach. The team constructed a highly detailed cutscene which painstakingly recreated a sequence from the comics in which Kyle Rayner first gained possession of his ring. The dialogue is lifted off the page almost verbatim, a sign of their renewed commitment to the source material. Gone was the original story of Zeos and its power-hungry queen, replaced with an attempt to more directly adapt Rayner's origins into video game form. The first level would have seen him navigating a particularly dangerous Los Angeles street, blasting gun-toting thugs with his ring. As opposed to generating a series of different shapes with the ring, as you did in the previous version, the game simplified its functionality to a projectile weapon. It could be upgraded into a series of increasingly more devastating green firearms, such as a rocket launcher via power-ups. After making his way through the mean streets, the Green Lantern was intended to come up against a first boss. This was based around the first villain Kyle encounters in the comics, an unnamed man in a mech suit who is wreaking havoc and attempting to siphon off the city's power supply. The boss battle was seemingly never finished. This third iteration of the project dispensed with the shoot-'em-up levels and Mode 7 stages and chose to focus on making a side-scrolling shooter with elements of platforming. Some other variety sections were planned, but the specifics of them were yet to be determined. For a few months, a skeleton team tinkered away on the project in around late 1994 through into 95. This consisted primarily of Bobby Earl and a few artists including John Reitzer and Ray Coffey. This small group allowed Ocean to redo Green Lantern according to DC specifications with less of a financial commitment, and having Bobby Earl develop it outside of work hours meant that resources were less impacted. These positives, however, couldn't ultimately offset the concerns that Ocean's higher-ups had held previously. The Super Nintendo was well into its twilight years by this point, and the company's trepidations about releasing new games on it were only growing. With the PlayStation set to arrive in the West later that year, and Nintendo's home console also looming, time was running out for Ocean's Green Lantern on the SNES. Realizing the potential for diminished sales, Ocean finally pulled the plug on the project for good. John Lomax, an artist who briefly worked on Green Lantern, put it thusly. Ocean decided it wouldn't make enough additional revenue above their marketing and development costs to continue any further. The reboot of the project just compounded the problem. Former employees indicate that the game still had a decent amount of development time ahead of it. A few different levels were mapped out, but remained largely incomplete. The game would have eventually portrayed different worlds beyond Earth, including one crawling with alien mercenaries. Some of the music written for the game was re-implemented in another Ocean game, Waterworld, for the SNES. In 2011, Dean Evans posted his Green Lantern soundtrack on YouTube. The project's demise represented the beginning of the end for Ocean's relationship with DC Comics. A year after its cancellation, the company axed a fighting game based around Lobo, which was being made for the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Years later, the Green Lantern game slipped into relative obscurity, before Frank Gasking's research finally uncovered the truth about its development, which was first published in his book, The Games That Weren't. Frank's efforts also brought to light a prototype cartridge from the end of development, recovered from former Ocean staffer Roy Fielding in 2019. You can learn more about the Green Lantern game in the Games That Weren't book and at gamesthatweren't.com. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. For more content from me, you can support the show at patreon.com/LiamRobertson, just like these kind people did.